Did you know that the person that we call the father of our country started life as an Englishman? That's because when he was born, there was no United States of America. But under his leadership, what began as 13 small colonies along the Atlantic coast became a brilliant new country with big ideas the world had never heard before. From military scout to colonial farmer to general to becoming the very first president of the United States, this man set the standard for what it means to be an American. He was none other than George Washington.
I was named for George Washington, you know.
Really? That's a pretty big name to live up to.
Tell us more about George Washington, that is.
Okay, we're gonna have to go way back in time, before there was the United States of America.
George Washington was born on February 22nd, 1732. Hard to believe that the father of our country was ever a baby himself.
Little George's parents were Mary Ball Washington and Augustine Washington, a wealthy landowner. The family lived in the colony of Virginia and were loyal subjects of the King of England, just like many other colonists of the time.
Excuse me? Kings? Colonies? What about the United States?
Remember, it didn't exist, not yet. The colonies we're talking about were established and settled mostly by citizens of Great Britain. While the colonists could make their own laws, they were still under the rule of Great Britain, and most of the time that was okay. Even though the people who lived in the colonies were separated from England by the Atlantic Ocean, most still considered themselves British. At the time, America was already populated with many different Native American tribes. Many of these tribes fought to prevent the colonists from taking their land. Life was very difficult for the first colonists, but they were tough, determined people. Despite the distance, the colonists kept close ties with Great Britain. George Washington even had brothers who had been sent to school in England and served in the British Royal Navy. It's likely that George Washington never set foot in a schoolroom. Since he came from a wealthy family, he learned the basics of reading, writing, and arithmetic at home, on the family's plantation with the help of a tutor. Washington was especially good at math and penmanship. To practice, he wrote out a list of 110 rules for good behavior. Things like, be careful to keep your promise, and sleep not when others speak. For Washington, these were words to live by, and later in life, people would comment on his excellent manners. But remember, George Washington was also just a typical kid. He probably spent a lot of time outdoors, running through the fields, riding horses, and climbing fences. There's even a story about his childhood that you might already know.
I know that story. Didn't he chop down his dad's cherry tree when he was a kid? And when his dad asked if he'd done it, George Washington said, "Yes, father, I cannot tell a lie."
Actually, the whole story itself is a legend. Just a tale someone invented to show how honest Washington was, even when he was just a kid. When Washington was 11, his father died, and his older brother Lawrence returned home for good and took over one of their father's farms. He renamed it Mount Vernon. Lawrence became George's best friend. Over the next few years, Washington grew tall and handsome. He was an expert horseman, and at the age of 16, he was hired as a surveyor by one of the most important landowners in the area.
A surveyor is someone who measures large areas of land and makes maps of them.
Because there were no existing maps of the western frontier, surveying was an important job in colonial America, and Washington was proud to be selected. In those days, with no cars or paved roads, surveying was very hard work. a surveyor was one part mapmaker and one part explorer. Washington had to learn how to survive in the deep woods. But he was bright, strong, and learned quickly. He even kept a journal of his travels and wrote about the Native Americans he met and the beautiful country he saw. In 1751, his brother Lawrence became ill and died. Washington was very sad, but determined to model his own life on that of his beloved brother. He had inherited Mount Vernon and soon applied for his brother's post in the Virginia militia. At the age of 20, he became Major George Washington.
What's a militia?
Militias were groups of colonists who volunteered to serve as part-time soldiers. Even though the British ruled the colonies, they couldn't afford to send British soldiers there to stay. So each colony had its own militia that helped to defend the colony against its enemies.
Who were they fighting?
Besides the Native Americans, who they often came into conflict with, the British were also fighting with their longtime enemy, France. Both the British and the French were claiming as much territory as possible, sometimes in the exact same spots.
Sounds like major trouble.
Oh, it was trouble, all right. And soon, Washington was going to find himself in the middle of a serious conflict. Let's take a look. In 1753, the governor of Virginia heard alarming tales about new French forts being built in places he considered to be English territory. Young George Washington volunteered to travel hundreds of miles by horse and on foot to deliver the governor's message to the French. Leave the area at once. The French refused, and Washington began his trip home to deliver the bad news. The governor was furious. He soon sent Washington and a military force back to the region to build a fort, which Washington called Fort Necessity. In a battle at Fort Necessity, Washington was defeated and forced to surrender. This was the first major battle in a conflict that soon spread across the colonial frontier. It became known as the French and Indian War. Washington served throughout much of the war, which continued until 1763, when the British finally defeated the French. At the age of 26 years, Washington was exhausted by the war, but he had established a reputation throughout the colonies for bravery and service. He returned to his home at Mount Vernon, where he soon found himself elected as a Virginia lawmaker.
This just in. Hello, Tracy. Reporting to you from Mount Vernon, Virginia. Today, Mount Vernon is open to the public, so people can see just how Washington lived over 200 years ago. Let's take a look around. Pretty impressive. George Washington lived a life of luxury at Mount Vernon, and it was here that he met a young widow with 2 small children. Her name was Martha Dandridge Custis, and they married in 1759. She and Washington never had children, but he adopted her kids as his own. In Washington's time, Mount Vernon was divided into 5 farms, each a complete unit with its own livestock, equipment, and buildings. Eventually, Mount Vernon grew into one of the largest and wealthiest farms in Virginia. There were hundreds of people living and working at Mount Vernon. But did you know, most of them were enslaved African Americans?
But George Washington was the father of our country. Didn't he know that slavery was wrong?
That's a tough question. Remember, many large plantation owners in the South depended on the work of enslaved African Americans to keep their farms running. Washington was no different. He was following the custom of his time. Of course, that doesn't make it right. Washington never spoke out against slavery, but in his will, he wrote that all of his slaves would be freed after he and Martha had died. Not many other slave owners did that at the time. Today, a monument stands at Mount Vernon to honor those enslaved African Americans whose hard work made it such a beautiful place.
As you can see, Mount Vernon was huge. And check out this view. The farm overlooks the Potomac River.
On the other side of the river, and a few miles up, is our capital city of Washington, D.C., named after you-know-who.
But in Washington's time, there was no capital city. After all, there wasn't even a United States of America yet. The American colonies still belonged to Great Britain. Stay tuned for more.
Back in Great Britain, King George III and the British government were trying to figure out how to raise money to pay for the French and Indian War. The British created new taxes to help pay for the war.
A tax is a way for a government to raise money by adding a fee to the products and property people buy.
The colonists were angry. They felt the new taxes were unfair and wanted to have their own representatives help decide who and what should be taxed. Since they had no vote in the British government to decide these matters, many colonists began refusing to pay. Like other leaders in the colonies, George Washington and other Virginia lawmakers voted to stop importing British goods and products. Colonists in Massachusetts were especially angry about the tax on tea, so angry that they planned a very special kind of protest. On the evening of December 16, 1773, men from the city who called themselves the Sons of Liberty disguised themselves and boarded the British ships.
I remember learning about the Boston Tea Party. The men ran onto the ships, grabbed the boxes of tea that were on the ships, and dumped them into the Boston Harbor,
turning it into the largest cup of tea in the world.
And the most expensive one. The colonists destroyed thousands of dollars worth of tea. Lawmakers in Britain were furious. They ordered Boston Harbor closed until the colonists paid for the tea. But the colonists were angry too. After the Boston Tea Party, they were ready to fight for their rights. In 1774, representatives from the 13 colonies gathered in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, to discuss why they were unhappy with British rule. They called themselves the First Continental Congress. George Washington was there, representing Virginia. So were a lot of other men who would also become part of American history, like John Adams, Samuel Adams, and Patrick Henry. But George Washington stood out. He was, as Patrick Henry later said, unquestionably the greatest man on that floor. 1 year later, relations between the British and the colonists, who were now calling themselves Americans, got violent. On April 19, 1775, British soldiers known as Redcoats, because of their bright red uniforms, fought with a local militia in Lexington, Massachusetts. 8 Americans were killed.
Then, at Concord, a group of colonial soldiers called Minutemen attacked the British to keep them from capturing their army supplies.
These events triggered the beginning of the American Revolutionary War. Everywhere, the new Americans began to ignore British rule.
1 month later, the Continental Congress met again. This time, Washington appeared dressed in his military uniform. The Congress voted to create an army, and they asked Washington to lead it.
George Washington was now General George Washington, Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army.
Unfortunately, the Continental Army wasn't much of an army. Shortly after accepting command, Washington galloped into Boston to take a look at the brave volunteers he'd heard about. He found a group of untrained, undisciplined, and highly disorganized militiamen.
And they're supposed to beat the British Redcoats? The best army in the world?
Well, you could imagine Washington's disappointment, but he was determined to whip them into shape.
This just in.
Less than 1 year later, in March of 1776, Washington was ready for a sneak attack on the British, still encamped in Boston. Under cover of darkness, the Americans crept from their camp outside the city into the hills to meet them. At dawn, March 5th, 1776, the British woke up to see troops and cannons staring them right in the face.
They were shocked. This was a battle they would surely lose.
At that point, Washington could have ordered the American patriots to open fire. Instead, he let the British retreat to their ships and out of Boston Harbor.
Could it be the war was over without firing a shot?
Not quite. Does anybody know what happened next?
July 4th, 1776. The Declaration of Independence.
That's right. The Declaration of Independence was written by another famous man and future president from Virginia, Thomas Jefferson. It was an official announcement to King George III that the colonies were breaking away from the British Empire.
They weren't colonies anymore. They were the United States of America. I bet King George was angry.
Ooh, very angry. How dare this ragged bunch of colonists defy him, a king? He sent even more British ships to America. At that time, it was the largest army England had ever sent. Rather than fight a losing battle, Washington and his troops retreated to safety. That's the mark of a good leader, to know when to pick your battles. And Washington chose to fight on Christmas, 1776 in Trenton, New Jersey. It would become one of the most famous battles of the war. Washington and his Patriot troops crossed the icy Delaware River early on Christmas morning. They were able to capture nearly 1,000 soldiers by surprise. The victory gave the Americans just the boost they needed to keep fighting and marked a turning point in the war. But the Americans needed help, so they appealed to France for soldiers and money. Even though Washington was a brave leader, he still had to struggle to hold his army together. In the winter of 1777, Washington led his troops to Valley Forge, Pennsylvania, to wait for spring and hopefully for help.
This just in. Hi, Tracy. Reporting to you from Valley Forge, Pennsylvania. It was here in 1777 that Washington and about 10,000 men from the Continental Army spent a bitterly cold winter. They were already exhausted and had very little food, clothing, or shelter. It seemed things couldn't get any worse. Thousands of cabins like these once covered the hills of Valley Forge. As many as 12 men would crowd into these teeny cabins. They could not wash themselves or their clothing. Lice infested everything. In spite of everything, Washington's troops received their first meaningful training of the war during these winter months, so they would be better prepared to fight the British in the spring. By April of 1778, the ragtag army was glad to hear that France had recognized the United States as an independent country and would help them in their fight against the British. Back to you, Tracy.
The war continued. It wasn't until 1781 that Washington had the chance for a real victory at Yorktown, Virginia. Lord Cornwallis and his British troops were camped there. Washington marched his soldiers hard until they finally reached Yorktown, where French warships were ready to attack. Washington ordered his troops to begin firing. And once they started, they didn't let up.
Wow, they made it! How long did the battle last?
They fought for several days. Cornwallis and his troops were cornered. Finally, a British soldier appeared with a white flag. Lord Cornwallis had surrendered. The Americans had won the war. But the war was not officially over until the signing of the Treaty of Paris in 1783. The British would leave the country for good, and behind them, they left a new country.
United States of America!
In the fall of 1783, Washington resigned from the army and returned to Mount Vernon to live a more peaceful life on his farm. He wanted only to live quietly at home with Martha. Washington was the most famous man in the world, but treated everyone who came to his home as a friend.
If he was so friendly, why did his portraits make him look so stiff and grumpy?
Funny you should ask. It has something to do with his teeth.
I heard George Washington had wooden teeth.
That's just a story, but he did have dentures. That's another word for false teeth. Washington's dentures were put together from cow teeth, human teeth, and walrus and hippopotamus tusks. Most of the time, he kept his lips pressed tightly together to keep them from popping out.
So that's why he looks so unhappy.
After a few years of living at Mount Vernon, it was clear that George Washington's country needed him badly. The new nation needed a government, but nobody could decide on exactly how the country should be governed. In 1787, at the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, Washington helped create one of the greatest documents in the world.
The Constitution of the United States.
Exactly. In a world of kings and queens, the Constitution was unique. It guaranteed that the United States would be a government of, by, and for the people. Their leaders would be elected and power would be shared. That way, there would never be a king or military dictator to control the voice of the people. This was something the world had never seen before. In 1789, 2 years after the Constitution was complete, George Washington was elected the very first president of the United States.
Since there had never been one before, no one knew exactly how a president should act. Washington was very careful to make sure that the office of president would be grand and impressive, but he refused to be treated like a king.
His biggest job was to get all the new states working together, and he created a group of advisors called a cabinet to help him. Washington also oversaw the creation of a new capital city for his new country. It would be called Federal City and include a house for the president called the White House. In the meantime, Washington lived and worked out of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. In fact, Washington is the only president of the United States to never have lived in either Washington, D.C. or the White House. He was such a popular president that he was elected to a second term in office. Washington's many supporters pressed him to run a third time. Some even wanted him to be president for life. But Washington had fulfilled his duty to his country and returned home to his beloved Mount Vernon in 1797. In 1799, Washington caught a cold while out horseback riding. This developed into a sore throat, and he then became quite ill. On December 14, 1799, George Washington died. He was buried at Mount Vernon.
200 years after his death, there are thousands of tributes to the father of our country.
The dollar bill and the quarter, of course. There are hundreds of places around our country named after him. The most important one is the capital of our country, Washington, D.C. And on the mall near the White House is a reminder no one who visits this city can overlook, the Washington Monument. Washington was a hero in his own time. Even when he was alive, his birthday was celebrated around the country. People looked up to him the same way as we do today.
It's easy to see why. After all, he never said no when his country asked him for help. He led them to independence.
He united the colonies under a strong government.
And he helped create the Constitution.
That's George Washington, a great American who really deserves the title Father of our country.